Thanks for giving me the opportunity to do this. I know this is not really the form that we had originally planned on when we talked about during this talk, but I'm glad that it can still happen. I'll just introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name's Jonathan Culp. Like Adrian said, I'm the lead engineer over at Sirvo Studios. And I'm not going to bore you with like a super long CV or anything, but Guildlings was my the third ship title that I made major contributions to, but it was the first role that I did so as a lead engineer. And I learned a ton from that process, even just going from, you know, like a senior development role to a lead role it's a world of difference, and it really kind of turns you upside down. So I've got a little slide presentation prepared. I'm going to introduce the game a little bit because I'm going to assume that people here aren't familiar with it. And then I'm just going to jump into what I learned. All right, can everyone see that? Someone give me confirmation that the slides are up.
Right now, John, I see Jonathan Culp has started screen sharing on the screen, but I don't actually see what's on your screen.
Okay. 1 second. How about now?
There it is.
Okay, great. Getting started. So I already talked about this. So I'm going to introduce the game, and then I'm going to talk about what I learned. And for some kind of confusing reason, I called this subheader Human Considerations for Systems Design, which is probably the most engineering thing I think I've ever written, because like, what other considerations are there for systems design? It's not like we like write code for cats, right? But I think when we talk about programming, there's just always sort of this assumption that the technical issues trump everything else. And I don't think we usually take a look at it from the other perspective, which is like, as people who may be consuming our code, like how are they interacting it? How are they interacting with it? How did the way we approach systems design like affect their ability to do their work well? Guildlings was made by your typical like small studio indie team. We had a long development process. So by and large, we were around 8 people. Sometimes during development, we were more than that. I think at our max, we were a studio of 12. Sometimes we were less than that. Unfortunately, close to shipping, we were like much less than that, but we were usually around 8 or so people. And of this team, we tended to skew sort of content creation heavy. So we had 3 full-time writers and 3 full-time artists. So Guildlings is first and foremost like a fantasy RPG. And our motivation for making the game was that we wanted to make something different from other fantasy RPGs out there. Fantasy literally means that like you can make anything up you want to. And we thought it was kind of weird that when given the opportunity to create a world from scratch, like most people end up creating a world set in medieval times with swords, magic, like dragons and orcs, basically. And don't get us wrong, like everyone in the team like loves these kinds of games, but we just thought there were, if you're not tethered to reality, why not do something more fun? So Guildling takes place in sort of an alternative universe that's a parody of current contemporary life. So each location sort of explores something about you know, current culture that we want to either parody or have some fun with. And a lot of what we're doing there is specifically taking a look at like internet culture and how maybe not so much me, but some of the younger members of the team, like a lot of their life happens online. So in this fantasy world, we kind of mesh together magic and technology. So they're really kind of the same thing in this world. So characters during dialogue sequences, they're sort of texting to each other at the same time that they're talking to each other. So in dialogue, they're free to use like emojis, and some characters are going to misspell things consistently, and so on and so forth. And then, you know, the other thing is that when you're making a fantasy RPG that's sort of set in medieval times, like everything is sort of like, for some reason, like everything is life and death. And we thought that there were really that there were more interesting stories to tell when you can talk about like someone's emotional states or conflicts that are not necessarily about dying or being injured. So a lot of what you're doing in the game is managing your characters' moods. So they can be in like 3 different negative moods and 3 different positive moods, and depending on their emotional state, they're going to be able to do different things. And so we do have sort of like a weird version of combat. It's not combat in the traditional sense. It's like really low stakes and kind of mundane combat. Like one of the first things you fight in the game is a living refrigerator, and then later like a stack of pancakes. And we sort of like that, you know, depending on how you proceed through this combat scenario, you're going to come out of that annoyed or frustrated, or like, you know, feeling victorious or chill about or something. And then another big goal for the design of the game was that we really wanted a cast that felt diverse and inclusive. We made a pretty conscious effort not to like hypersexualize any of our characters. All right, and then some of the adversaries that you're gonna face in Guildlings, like they're basically on take on sort of contemporary viewpoints or like online personalities. So these children here in cardboard armor, they're basically our take on internet trolls, right? So, you know, we had a lot of fun with this. We wanted to speak to modern issues, but we also didn't want to like single any like person out. These people kind of, they represent viewpoints or different takes on, you know, perceiving the world or how you should act. Like we really wanted to like not make fun of anybody specifically. So the whole thing, we just kind of summed it up in our tagline of Wizards and Wi-Fi. And that's to say that this is a game that's about, you know, fundamentally about what it's like to sort of live online and interact with people and themes of connection. But at the same time, it's also, in some sense, like a very traditional fantasy RPG where you've got magical powers and you've got quests and a party that's trying to save the world. But I think I mentioned this in, or at least it's written up a little bit in the talk description, which is, that's not the game that we started making when we first sat down as a company. Earlier versions of this game were not an RPG in the slightest bit. Like at one point we had a character creator, and at another point we thought that this is going to be like a battle simulation game with a lot of like slow play elements and asynchronous play. And we spent a good chunk of our early development just trying to find the right form for this narrative. And I think some of that was our team just really wanting to reject anything that we had seen before, which is not necessarily a great idea because, you know, we reinvented the wheel, and not just the wheel, like we reinvented like the steering wheel and the doors and like the headlights. Like we almost had an allergy to doing anything that had done before. But eventually we settled upon an RPG for its form because it's a form that was familiar to a lot of people. They could hop into it, and it was really the thing that served the narrative the best. And the consequence of that shift sort of hit me all at once when our studio was out during happy hour with another studio, and we were just kind of having some chat, and they're like, tell us about what you're working on. And I think our creative director responded with like this little gem, and he was just like, it's sort of like Dragon Age, but for your phone. And that took me aback so much that I like almost did a spit take with my beer. And my team was looking at me strangely being like, why does Jonathan think this? Why is this funny to him? And the reason is because it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks that we had gone from making a game that like felt really manageable to me to completely exploding our scope. You know, I knew some people who were working at BioWare at the time, and like the team that made Dragon Age is like 100 people strong, more than that even. And so I was thinking, like, is this really the game that we're trying to emulate? And clearly, you know, we already talked about not in tone. So what they meant by this comment was like in scope or in complexity. And it kind of freaked me out a little bit. So I lost a lot of sleep over that conversation. And, you know, I started thinking, like, how does a team of 8 people try to make Dragon Age? And especially not just any team, but like our team, right? It's a much more complex game than the one we had been making before. And from my perspective, tackling it well was going to require a lot of processes and like design techniques from AAA development. And just as a studio, culturally, like, I'll just be honest, like a lot of us were just kind of addicted to hacking stuff together. And I wasn't really sure that we were going to be able to pull this off. And one of the big technical reasons for that is save files. Like the second you introduce save states into your game, you really explode the complexity of what you're making. A lot of games have really simple save states, right? Like this is the save state for something like Candy Crush, right? Which is like, what level am I on? And even online multiplayer shooters like don't have to restore state. There's no save there. So they can have a save state that's almost as basic as this, really. When you load up the level, like the initial state, that level is known, and then it changes and morphs into chaos, but because you never need to restore to that chaotic state, and you just move on to the next level, you don't really have to manage that kind of data. So you can go your entire career without really working on a game where your data management becomes really complicated. So, you know, we went from a game that I felt like we had a pretty good handle on to something that looked more like this. And this is just a screenshot of at least some of our state classes. I did a quick get info on the folder that we put all these classes in. It's something like 100 classes and like close to a whole megabyte of just written text. And, you know, most of what you're looking at here are just some getters and setters, like basic accessors. This is just kind of the size of the data that we need to write out to disk. And the cost of this is not necessarily how long your game is or, you know, how many levels you have. The cost of how big your save state is really the diversity of interactions in it, just the amount of things that you need to keep track of. So, you know, I know in game development, there's sort of this perception that like the really hard problems are like 3D math or like writing compute shaders or optimizing memory. I actually think that managing state is the hardest part of programming. And it's not a very like math heavy part of programming either. And I think most design patterns and most programming techniques really come down to trying to simplify the ways that you manage state in an application. So I knew this was going to pose some pretty big challenges for our team. And I decided that I needed to take like a data-driven approach to programming. And unfortunately, I don't really have time to kind of cover those technical aspects of what we built. But I can give you an example of how this changes what you're writing and how it makes it harder to deal with. So this is an example from Guildlings, which is our writing team has the ability to write some basic quest logic, right? They can, when you're interacting with characters in dialogue sequences, depending on the dialogue choices you make, they may like grant you an item or finish a quest or start a quest. Additionally, our writers can also like sequence or queue up a bunch of actions to happen at the close of a dialogue sequence. So if we condense a character to unlock a gate for us, we may, when we stop chatting with them, take the camera, pan it over to a door, show an animation where the door unlocks, and then pan back to the character. So what this means is that basically like a lot of quest logic is spread out over time in the application. And this can lead to problems when saves are involved. So this is sort of like the minimum problematic example I could think of. And I don't know, maybe this is jumping out at some people. Maybe it's not, but this code, which seems really straightforward, and obviously this is pseudocode, and I'll go through and explain it, actually has like a really crippling bug inside of it. And so what you're looking at here is our game, which has a policy of saving on application exit. So when we get a notification to put the app in the background, we create a save so we can pick up where the player left off. And when you do something like this, when you save now has the potential to cause bugs. Because depending on your game state, it might not be in a state that can be restored. So the bug here is that we've got some coroutine here that's running a tutorial sequence. And we're checking to see if the play tutorial flag has been set to true. And if it is, we set it to false so that it doesn't run twice. And then we play the tutorial, which is, which is itself like another coroutine. So it's going to take some amount of time to complete. And then once the player is done with the tutorial, we mark their tutorial quest as having been finished. And the problem here is if the player were to quit in the middle of the tutorial sequence, we would have already set that play tutorial flag to false. That action would have been recorded in the autosave, and when we boot back up, we're not going to go through the tutorial again, and this quest is never going to get marked as complete. And this is, in my opinion, one of the worst kinds of bugs you can have, because when we write code, we usually write it with the assumption that nothing's going to go wrong, right? And throughout development, this is probably going to work satisfactorily. Like no one's probably going to quit during the tutorial sequence. But, so this bug has a really high probability of going out into the wild. And even if only like 1% of people who play your game see this, if you have 1 million downloads of your game, like, I don't know, what's the math on that? Like 1,000 people or something, like, it's still a very high number of people are going to encounter this bug. So this bug is not something that throws an error, it's just incorrect behavior. And it's something that's not going to be obvious to catch. Secondly, I wrote this bug up in like a toy form to make it as obvious as I could what was going on. But in a real production setting, the cause and effect of launching or checking to see if we should play a tutorial or another coroutine that takes some amount of time, these things can be spread out over multiple methods or multiple gameplay systems. Like these things can be attached to trigger volumes or they could be put into a timeline sequence. And then tracking these kinds of asynchronous logic bugs down becomes kind of a real nightmare. And to really be proactive about avoiding these kinds of scenarios, whoever is writing this code basically needs to think to themselves every time they write a function, like, if the player quit here and I were to restore my save, would it function properly? And so this was of a really big concern to me. And if I were the only one coding this game, like, maybe I wouldn't lose too much sleep of it, but I'm in Guildlings, like, I'm not the person who's going to be writing this. One of our writers probably is, because this is quest logic, and I'm not designing the quests, so I'm not writing the quest logic. So this kind of represented like a pivot point for me, which was that as an engineering lead, my job wasn't just about how can I write the best systems possible, but my job was about like the overall build health. And it was also about how to manage other people's contributions to the game. And so that's sort of the big thing that I started wrestling with during this development process, is like, how do you manage contributions by team members of varying technical ability? And, you know, I really wouldn't expect someone from our writing team to approach their writing like this. Like, I don't want to weigh them down with all the things that could go wrong in the scripts that they're writing. I really just want them to focus on writing engaging content. And, you know, this was especially challenging for us because we had a really wide spread of technical ability on the team. Of the people, so of the 8 core members, 5 of them would be writing code. 2 of them considered themselves only hobbyist coders. 2 of the writers had never coded before in their career. You know, so I was worried about the added complexity that this was adding. And so, as far as I'm concerned, like, this is one of the not so spoken aspects of managing code. And that's, as an engineering lead, like, you have a lot of effect on how other people can do work. And there are a lot of different, every studio's got sort of a different answer to this question of like, how do we balance build health with, you know, letting people of lesser technical skill make meaningful contributions? And, you know, the AAA version of this has some really terrible answers. And the first thing that they probably say is like, you can place unrealistic expectations on people. Like, everyone on your team has to be a great writer and a great coder at the same time. And you can scare the crap out of them by like threatening to let them go every time they make a game-breaking bug. And so this is an aspect of AAA development I just really hate. I think it's really kind of inhumane. And it was something that I definitely wanted to avoid. And I don't know if you can see here, like, here's a tweet from somebody who worked at Rockstar like about a decade ago, and he got in trouble for calling in sick, right? But there are other more like structured approaches to this that are more about systems design. And these basically come down to ideas of sandboxing. And so we can place designers or writers in restricted environments or languages where they're less likely to cause like massive problems. And so like some languages are built from the ground up with this idea, like Lua is one of them. Like, it's got really good ways to like bind to a more technical language like C++, and you can expose only like bits of your gameplay code to scripters. And those become sort of like Legos that they can play with. Even the design of Unity as an engine and its choice of C# as a language is really based off of this idea of sandboxing too. Like, you know, if you throw an exception in your code in Unity, it disables the component that it was written into. The game engine doesn't crash unless you configure it to. Mostly it just kind of like chugs along. So it lets people who are maybe new to game development like learn faster because they're not sort of weighed down by all the extra technical complications. And a really extreme example of this is that, oh God, if this is recorded, I can't name the studio, but I have a friend who works for a AAA studio, and all their designers work in a language where none of them are allowed to declare variables. So like, if you think like Lua or C# is restricted, just like imagine trying to work in that setting. I guess they had a point during one of their games where I guess if a designer had the ability to create variables, they just totally smashed the amount of available memory on the device. And from that point on, they were like, no more, can't be trusted, like no more variables for anybody. That sounds pretty miserable to me. Visual scripting is another great way to sandbox stuff. You know, something like Kismet. That's a way of removing the burden of learning in, a language syntax from somebody. I wouldn't necessarily write a whole game in it, but it's a great way to sandbox a contribution. Then a third option is just like, you know, studios love this, like put somebody in a non-essential system, like let them like handle the chickens in the farm and like they'll run away from people and they'll like pick seeds. So just like, don't put them on a thing that's like super critical to your game. So what this meant to me as lead engineer was like, I actually now have two bosses. Like one of my bosses is the build and making sure that bugs don't sneak into the game. But I also have to think about my team's productivity. And I can't demand like unreasonable things of them. And so, I don't know if this makes sense, but if you kind of put this on a spectrum, when we're designing systems for designers, we have sort of like on one extreme, like give them complete autonomy. They can do whatever they want. But the risk there is that, you know, bugs may be more likely in the system. Or we can be super overprotective about it. Like as soon as we see an error condition, we can throw up a modal dialog box and like force them to deal with that error, which is a thing that I've seen. It's actually a thing that I learned from NetherRealm, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But neither of the extremes of the spectrum are like really, really good in my opinion. For example, like this is an example of code that's too permissive. And so it's always trying to recover from errors. So it's, but what's actually happening is that you're just kicking the problem down the road further, where it's gonna be harder to fix at a later date. So I'll go through this line by line and kind of explain what I mean by it. And then I'll also explain why this is a really bad thing to write for an RPG like ours. So what we have here is a system that's trying to keep track of the points of interest that the player was last at. And when we load up the game again, we try to put them back at the last known point. And in this function call here that does a locations.find, it's going to return null if it can't find the ID of the node. And this is something that's fairly common during development, is that you're removing bits of content, you're adding bits of content, and you're renaming the linkages of things. So this is a thing that would break fairly regularly as you're doing your content creation. And so as a way to sort of say, hey, like we changed the name of something, like don't worry about it, just try to continue. We may try to make a designer's life easier by saying, you know, if the point that you were looking for isn't around anymore, just return the player to level start. And, you know, try to recover that way. And the goal here is just to sort of like unblock designers, you know, like get them iterating on content faster. But if something like this makes it into a shipping product, this is a piece of code that can create a progress blocker for a player. It can put them in a state where they just can't progress through the game anymore. Because imagine what would happen if level start is now behind like a locked door, or just any part of the level that is no longer accessible. So I think, you know, this is an example of code that's too permissive and too has the potential for too many bugs, and I wouldn't want to see something like this in a shipped product. But you know, the other extreme, you know, something that I learned from the short time that I spent in AAA development was, another realm we had this idea that of continuous integration, which is the best way to keep a product bug-free is to start with something that doesn't have any bugs to begin with, and then maintain that state for as long as possible. So they were very aggressive about what happened when an error was seen. Usually what they would do is they would just show a modal dialog box saying like, hey, this is an error. You'd hit the OK button and the application would quit. And the idea there was that like, you needed to fix that bug, like not later, like now. This was really nerve-wracking as a developer, because like when you broke the build, like the entire company stopped working, right? And they all know like who broke it, and it really motivated you, again through fear, to fix the mistake you made as quickly as possible. I think when I first sat down to design some systems for Guildlings, I was sort of going with that approach of like, this is how the pros do it. This is how we're going to do it. And when I took that tack with some of our systems, like our designers basically just revolted. They were like, this is absolutely the worst thing I've ever had to deal with in my life. Like, they just really didn't. They really didn't want to like stop what they were doing to go fix a bug. And it took me a while, but I sort of, I totally understand where they're coming from. So the most impactful work that I did on Guildlings was sort of about resolving this issue of like, what is the appropriate level of response for an error? And this led me to think about an approach to tools building, where I thought about every tool that I built on a sort of spectrum of safety, right? I can give somebody really safe, or I can give somebody something really dangerous. And you know, these are both things that cut, right? And giving somebody like kitty scissors may seem like really insulting, but if all they have to do is like cut paper, maybe that's the appropriate tool. But if you give somebody a chainsaw, like, you know, it's potentially a deadly weapon, right? And so, you know, sort of the question is like, which one do you give people? And I think that there are situations where both are appropriate. And so not only do we think about like the safety of the system we're designing, but also, you know, how useful or useless something is. If your task is to clear a forest, there's no safe tool for that. You know, you just have to concede that the right tool for the job is dangerous and there's nothing you can do about it. If you need to clear a forest and you don't have anybody who knows how to use a chainsaw, the only solution to that is teach them how to use the chainsaw, right? Or just like hand it to them and like hope everything works out. So throughout the course of development, I definitely gave somebody, I designed systems that were like kitty scissors, and I designed systems that were like chainsaws, right? The only thing I would not recommend designing is something from the useless and dangerous quadrant of this graph, which metaphorically would be like a piece of raw glass, right? This is something that, yeah, like you can use it to cut, but you're probably just gonna mangle the crap out of your hands with it. I can't think of like any game or system that would fit this quadrant very well. Like maybe Gary's mod or something like that would fall in that category of tool. I don't know. So for me, some of the most impactful work that I did as an engineer was trying to solve this problem of like, how do you surface error messages to your designers and writers in ways that both protect build stability and also don't create nightmares for them. So I'll just, how are we doing on time? Not boring anybody too badly. So I'll just go over some of the considerations, some direct examples from Guildlings. So one very common thing you may do when you see a bug is just like shoot an error message to the console. And this is not something that I usually recommend doing. But for some things, this really is totally okay. I only really do this for situations where the effect of the misbehavior does not ripple out into the system. Like if you were trying to play an audio asset that was missing, like the worst that's gonna happen is like the sound doesn't play. Whereas you were trying to retrieve a piece of data that you were expecting to be there, like that has the ability to sort of snowball into a much bigger bug. So for simple things like, yeah, you can put it in the console. But one of the really bad things about doing that is like designers should like, maybe you work with like really clean designers, but in my professional experience, like designers just ignore the console completely. This screenshot is from like 10 seconds of loading our third level of the game, like in the shipping version of Guildlings. And these are all like content bugs. These are like IDs that weren't assigned or things that are trying to reference something that doesn't exist. And so because the console gets flooded so much, like whenever you have something that is really important, it's just gonna get buried under a lot of mid-level stuff. So when I'm dealing with errors, I like to do something a little bit more severe. And one of my favorite tools for this is an error asset, which is an asset that takes place of another one that should basically be there. And so the reason that I like this is because it lets a designer continue working, but it's not shy about what's going wrong, right? So for instance here, like somebody mistyped the ID for an NPC, we can't load their character portrait. So instead of showing nothing, we show the error asset and we try to make it descriptive. Like we try to put the ID that they used that we failed the lookup for. And this works for other things as well. And you know, you can use it for 2D images, but I think it's especially good for 3D assets, especially ones that are normally invisible and maybe misconfigured. So in a case where maybe you had a trigger volume that was referencing some piece of data improperly, what I would do here is I would, when the level loads, I would capture the error. I wouldn't throw an exception here. I'd disable that component and then I'd replace it with an error mesh. And the reason I like this approach is because these things aren't likely to stay in the build for very long. They're sort of embarrassing. Like when you go to playtest and something like this pops out, it's kind of like a gut punch. It's like, ooh, like I left a bad bug in the game. Whereas if you don't show anything, or if you try to recover from this, it's easy to create content that's misbehaving and makes it into the shipping version because the effect of it is so non-noticeable. If I had to do Guildlings from scratch, I think I would have done an audio error asset because I think 90% of our log spam is about sound components trying to play audio clips that do not exist. And I'd probably replace it with like a chicken sound or something so that every time you tried to play an audio clip that doesn't exist, like you'd hear it like a I think that would probably get it fixed pretty quickly. The other thing that I felt that was really impactful about our work was that we spent a lot of time writing custom inspectors for things. I think when I first sat down, I thought that this was kind of like a bells and whistles thing. But what you're seeing here is most of our assets reference some piece of data stored in a database. So there's an ID for it that needs to be retrieved. And just this simple act of adding a little find button that listed all of the possible IDs that could fill this slot with like a fuzzy search bar, that had a really big impact on our design team's productivity. And it only took like a day to code. And so I also did a lot of sandboxing. Our writing team, all of our dialogue is handled by the Ink engine, which for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's similar, it fills a similar need that something like Twine does. But the design of it's actually completely different. But writers had access to a limited set of methods that affected game state. And this was a way of trying to keep what they were doing relatively safe. And some of the things that they would write weren't safe in certain contexts. So if the context was wrong, we display errors for that. And that kind of brings me to my next point, which is how you approach bugs in your game doesn't have to be like an all or nothing thing. One of the things we did a lot was designers would ask for debug functions that they could use as they were making content that I felt were sort of unsafe for production. So rather than say, no, like these are tools that you cannot use because they're not safe, an example of something like that might be like taking a quest out of its completed state and bumping it back to its open state. Rather than saying like, no, you can't use these things, we created one version of the game where you could use unsafe tools. And then when it came time to playtest or QA our builds, we forced everybody to compile the game in strict mode, in which these functions weren't even available for access. They were conditionally compiled out so that I could guarantee, sort of that nobody was using like, there was no like code funny business going on, that like no one was using the debug tools as a crutch for content creation. So I'm gonna try to wrap this up quickly. This is probably a bit longer than I thought it would be. When I was making tools and I got something wrong, usually it came down to sort of making a wrong guess in one of these aspects. I'd write something that could only be used one at a time, and I wouldn't predict that people would want to use it concurrently. Like the dialogue system initially, I thought there's only ever going to be one dialogue sequence up on the screen at any given time. So I'm not going to take the extra steps to make sure that we could have two running side by side. And this turned out to be like an incorrect assumption. And similarly, like in the same vein, that you can make that mistake versus like you think a designer only needs one of something and they turn out that they need many of it. Saves can be kind of like that. Like a lot of people write static managers where there's like a current save. And I took a lot of steps in Guildlings to make sure that we could have multiple save files active at the same time. I don't know if that's obvious as to why you would want to do that, but it helps with data migration. Like when you go from one version of your save file to another, it helps to be able to boot up the old version and the newer version, and then write an upgrade path for that. And that's not something you can do when you write a system where your assumption is that there's only one save active at any moment. For trigger volumes or any sort of collision detection, the parallel there is like separate versus nested. Our designers had asked for a camera volume that when you enter it, like zooms the camera in a little bit, and when you exit it, returns to the default. But if you nest one inside the other, which they did later on, entering that smaller volume inside the bigger one counts as leaving the first one, and it would cut back to the default camera, not to the nested trigger volumes camera, right? Sorry, it's not very well explained. But in situations like that, where you've got a lot of like multiple entries and multiple exits for things, you want to switch from using Booleans for keeping track of those and switch to using a stack for keeping track of that. And then the other thing to think about is the ways in which the tools that you're making, and not just the tools, but like the code you write or the API can be put together in unexpected combinations, and try to code defensively to detect when that might happen. So an example of that in Guildling is like, we had these autosave volumes that when like a player entered them, it would save their game. And later on, we added ladders. And one of our designers put an autosave volume by a ladder, which is a totally reasonable thing to think would work, right? But at the time that we wrote our save system, we never accounted for any of the NPCs any of your party being off the nav mesh. So if you were unlucky enough to hit this volume on the way down the ladder, when you booted your game back up, they would spawn in midair and not be connected to the nav mesh, and the game would be unresponsive at that point. So when you're making things, like, just keep in mind that it's never really gonna go the way you think it will. All right. And so when you're writing tools, try to think about the ways that the people who use your tools are gonna interact with them. And so I would say try to avoid saying things like, don't use it like that. Granted, as a programmer, you can't really account for every situation, and there's always going to be a dangerous way to use the systems you design. But if you find yourself saying, don't use it like that a lot, it's usually an indication that you didn't code it safely enough, right? Try to code your system so that so that there's no way to put them together in a way that's like too dangerous. The second thing is, like, if a designer asks you for a thing, it's okay to push back a little bit on what they're asking for. As an engineer, you're gonna have a lot of expertise in designing robust systems. And it's okay to offer that up as opinion and to say, hey, you asked for this, but is maybe this better? Would you consider doing it like this? And you may be able to improve upon what was asked of you. Third thing is, like, use the tools you write for somebody else. And I don't mean just check that they work properly. Like, if you're writing somebody a bunch of components for putting a level together, actually put a level together from start to finish. That's gonna give you an idea of where the friction points are with your tools. And being an industrious person, you're gonna go through and try to eliminate those friction points. And you're never gonna discover them any other way. And then the last thing is, like, if something isn't working, a designer is not necessarily going to ask you for, like, an improvement. Maybe this was more of a problem for our team on Guildlings, because a lot of our people worked remote, so they were sort of hesitant about bothering you in the middle of the workday. But I think it's important to be proactive about the ways in which your tools can be improved, and to check in with your design team and ask them if it's working for them. Because you can hand somebody a tool, but they're never going to use it in exactly the way you expect them to use it, right? So for instance, like, during the dialogue system, our designers asked for the ability to make, like, a lighter version of it, like a chat bubble that shows up over the character's head, not like a full screen dialogue. And so we exposed some of the writing system to the level designers, and I thought that they would be creating conversation files and loading those up. And one of our designers just didn't like the default timings of things, so he created 10 different conversations, one for each line of dialogue in a single conversation, just so he could like play with the timings of it. Like never got back to me and was like, hey, could this tool be improved? So, you know, it's good to check in every once in a while and see that what you're making is being used in the way that you expect it to be. I'm gonna try to sum this up real quickly, which is the big picture of what we've been talking about is that all the work we do sort of exists along this axis of like code cleanliness. And on the extremes of this axis are like two tribes that fight like cats and dogs. And like one point of view is like hack it together as fast as you can and like get it out there. And this is about like results and trying to move fast. And the other camp is maybe more process driven, which is to say that they think that the way you go about building your software matters more than the final result. And the question for me in Guildlings was really like, where do I want to be on this axis? Because it's not just my point of view that matters, it's also what my team can deal with. And I started out thinking we really needed to be very far to the right to make this game a success. And I think we ended up somewhere in the middle. And that's not to say that the middle is the best place to always be. I think both extremes of the spectrum have really valid points. And really where you wind up here isn't a matter of right and wrong. It's about the kind of game you're making and the kind of team that you have. You know, I don't think GTA 5 can be hacked together. I don't think that's a kind of game you could make with like nothing but pristine technique. But at the same time, really excellent games can be made without a ton of technical background. Oh, and if it seems like I'm sliding like Ridiculous Fishing and D as like being like hacked together games, like that's by the designers' like own self-admission. Like I think they would agree with this assessment. Maybe not so much Dota 1. That was definitely an opinionated call on my part. But yeah, I could go longer, but I think I should wrap it up there.
So John, officially, I don't remember if I set the meeting for 9 or 10. We do have time if you want to go a little longer. We've got 4 questions queued up, and I've got some written down myself. But that being said, if you want to go a little bit longer, you definitely have time.
No, I think I'll wrap it up there. Yeah, I think my presentation sort of starts to unwind after that point.
Okay, cool. I'm going to go through the questions then. If you prefer it that way, or you can, or if you want to do the Q&A, you can read them back yourself. If that's the case, I would just say just read them out loud. But that being said, I can just read them to you if you prefer that.
Sure. I'm gonna I just need to gather my window because I'm working off of multiple monitors. My second monitor is actually behind me.
Yeah, no problem. Do your thing. Yeah, okay. Take 1 second, and we'll be back with you in just a second. I just want to remind everybody out there while John gets that cleaned up. Again, there is a Q&A section here. If you have any questions about anything that John brought up, or any questions that come out of the questions that I'm going to be reading off in just a second, please feel free to use that Q&A section and start queuing up some questions for him now.
All right, yeah, so I've got my windows gathered back on the main display. So let's, okay, so what kinds of from Phil Simmons, what kinds of communications or evaluation processes did you establish to find out what tools were needed and what needed to change in existing tools? My answer to this is going to be really boring. It mostly came down to stand-up. We had stand up with our team every day. It was kind of a requirement because, like I said, like a lot of our team worked remotely throughout the process. I don't think there was really any magic here. It really just came down to like constant communication.
John, before you move on to the next question, I actually did write something that was kind of similar to that question, but has a little bit more detail. If you don't mind, like a small follow-up.
Oh, no, not at all.
I was curious about like the early stages of the tool development and those stand-ups. If you considered when you were considering these tools, were they being considered during pre-production once you reached the RPG side? Because I know that part came later. Were there talks about the tools during pre-production? Did you talk with designers, like the designers early on, about what features these tools should have, how they should work, and try to minimize those improvements? And do you think that's practical? Do you think that's a practical expectation, or is it better to just kind of like make the tools and then do the improvements, as you go?
So we definitely took the latter tack with that. We didn't do a lot of pre-production. I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain this, but basically it's kind of like fly by your pants coding, right? Like every day we'd show up and like the designers would have a new idea, and I think they would ask, how long would it take you to get like a working version of that up and running? And I'd usually give them something. I could give you like something really rough in like 3 days. I could give you something more fleshed out in like a week and a half. And if you need it pristine, like, I don't know, maybe that would take like 3 months. And that gave me a way to deliver them limited systems that they could test as proof of concepts before they really asked me to double down on the work and try to make it really robust.
Cool, thank you. And next question.
All right. Okay, next one from Phil. I'm just gonna take them in the order that they're coming in. So sometimes they're gonna double up on whoever asked. Phil is asking, how much overhead did it take to set up and maintain the error assets approach? And how often did it end up finding issues during the dev? It was really cheap to set up. Basically, we only use this when like ID linkages were bad, and that means something very specific to Guildlings. I don't really know if that means much to anybody listening, but it's just kind of a way of saying like a missing field or a missing asset link. And it found issues in development all the time. It never lost its value. It was especially clutch in the points of interest examples. Those things broke a lot because a lot of these things were just kind of easy to lose in the editor view. They'd wind up below the floor or like tucked into a wall or something. And because the designers no longer had a line of sight to it, they'd leave a lot of dead assets lying around the level. And this is really one of the only ways that we spotted some of them. All right. Jason Corbett is asking, how difficult was it to use ink, and how difficult was the process of integrating ink with your other systems? Did you have to build extra tools to work with the narrative? Really good question. I think if there's one thing our writer would have preferred I chose differently, it would have been our choice of narrative engine. He had a Twine background, and I think he would have preferred that we stayed in Twine. We hopped on ink pretty early because we were really impressed with some of the talks that we saw about it in GDC. And we ran into quite a few issues with it. I'm still of the opinion that it was the right call to make. I don't think Twine would have served our game nearly as well. Ink was really good at being able to bind functions in the ink narrative to the C# code. But at least when we hopped on it, it had some really bad bugs with it. One of which was that in certain situations, the scripting function evaluation would happen twice, which made it really difficult to write functions that had side effects. And so let me just repeat that. Like, basically there was a bug in Ink where sometimes it would call your functions twice. So if you had like a function that like added a number to another number, like you would get double that number. And that was really terrible. So we actually locked our development of Guildlings to a specific version of Ink to avoid that bug. Yeah. Let's see, what else can I say? We ended up with one Ink file per level. We were a little bit worried that trying to have one giant Ink file for the entire game was going to take up an onerous amount of memory. So I actually really appreciated Ink's ability to chunk up like that into different sections. I'm not sure that Twine would have handled that as well. Kotaro is asking, if you were to build a dialogue system now, how would you approach the architecture now? That's a good question. In Guildings, I basically had three options. One was to try to get Twine working in C#. At the time that we were writing our game, our team evaluated the options for doing that, and we weren't totally happy with them. We ended up with Ink because we felt that it was the most Unity compatible option out there at the time. But the third option was actually to roll our own dialogue system. And we ended up not doing that just because we felt that we didn't have the engineering resources for it. Yeah, that's all I gotta say. All right. Okay, Philip is asking, which were the most difficult designer tools to maintain and adapt throughout the dev cycle, and which tools ended up being the most stable? Okay, so the most difficult designer tool to maintain was definitely the sequencers. And how to explain this? So during development, our designers who, by and large, were not writing scripts and didn't feel that they had the capability of like learning a lot of C# during the development process, asked me for a lot of tools for sequencing different things together. And they started small, so they'd be like, I just need a way to like launch into combat after a text sequence is finished, or like a dialogue sequence is finished. And then they'd be like, okay, well, I want to like, I want to do a camera thing after a dialogue sequence is finished. And the thing that was most difficult about that was that every time they asked for a new thing to do, I coded like a custom component for it. And it wasn't until that I had coded about like 12 of these things that I realized that basically they incrementally had me completely replace the timeline system in Unity, and that everything that I had been writing would have been better served by writing custom timeline tracks. So those were the most difficult tools, and we ended up stripping those out, and we got rid of all of our sequencer classes and switched our cutscenes over to proper timeline stuff. As far as which tools ended up being most stable throughout the dev cycle, I wrote a lot of debug tools for like warping around the level and the fuzzy text finder. Those proved to be the most useful. So the architecture of Guildlings is basically based off of the idea of like data-driven programming. So that was sort of the biggest architectural success I felt, was that people didn't really, we didn't have like a bunch of different methods for causing change in the game world. Like if you changed it in data, most of the interactive objects in the game world were set up through the observer pattern, and they were just trained to sort of respond to changes in data and make the appropriate transitions. So that made some of our tooling really easy to work with. Like you never had to like walk up to a door to unlock it. Like you could just go into the data, like set its property to unlocked, and then like everything was programmed in such a way that like the animation system like was aware of that transition and it played the animation. And it just, Guildlings could not have been built using any other design strategy, really. It just would have been, there would have been too many race conditions and too many ways of accomplishing the same thing. So Timothy Scully asks, how did your team get together? Good question. So the more senior levels of the team, me, myself, Ryan, Asher, and Jamie, we'd all known each other at USC for the games program there. And the way we assembled the rest of our team was that I think we literally hit like Tumblr and Twitter and looked for artists, mostly on the art side. This is what we did. We looked for artists that matched in tone the feeling of the game, and we basically hired them from their like Tumblr and Twitter portfolios, and just sort of took it on faith that, you know, if they were interested in making a game, like we could, even if they didn't have any previous experience in the industry, that we could manage it. And as far as our writing team goes, that was done through a lot of networking during GDC and a lot of word of mouth. Yep.
Cool. All right, John. So we got a little less than 15 minutes until 9. I do have a couple of questions myself for you, and I can't type in the Q&A myself, otherwise I would have just done that. So firstly, I wanted you to see if you could expand a little bit more about like back when you were thinking about the scope of this, when they first decided, you know, this was going to be an RPG. You said that like one of I believe it was a marketer, you said had came up with this like Dragon Age but on the phone, which is a very marketing way of like, you know, trying to like boil this game down for like mass consumption, right? And like I also have, I'm a designer by trade, but I definitely have had that similar experience where like early on, the person who's more in charge of like selling the game to people would come up with something that would like make my like brain go in a lot of crazy ways. And clearly you've been like thinking about this a lot, like as you brought up in your talk. Do you feel like that anxiety got relieved at any point during development, like as you like started to like, you know, create these pipelines and create these systems that, and did the scope change? Like, did you like see like, okay, we can cut as we go, to try and relieve that kind of anxiety you were feeling about like, you know, the scope at that point?
So two answers to that. Did my anxiety about the scope ever go away? Absolutely not. Like, not even for like, sorry, this is just like a super honest answer. And maybe this says more about me, like as I approach my work professionally, but like I was always worried about the scope of the game. Like up until the day we launched. And I think this is pretty common when you work on a long project or a project that blows its deadline, and Guildlings definitely did, which is that, you know, you've been sprinting for such a long time, but that by the time you're sort of at the finish line, like you don't have any idea how your game is going to be received, or really if it's any good, because the aspects of the game that bother you, like you've been looking at them for so long that they're magnified in your mind. And the things about the game that are working really well, like you may have just come to take them for granted. So when you put a game out for a publication, like you literally do not know if it's any good or not. And I was actually shocked that Guildlings did well. Not because I thought we were a bad team or that we didn't have a game worth showing, but I thought that maybe the audience for it was too niche to be appreciated. So it was a great relief to me that this project was a success. As for the answer to your second question, which is, did the scope change? Yeah, several times. And I'd say the game that was released was probably about a fourth of what we thought our minimum viable product was. So even after we thought there was no more to cut, we cut some more. And that's the game that got released. And speaking of which, we have a lot of levels and a lot of content and just quests and writing that didn't make it into the published version of this game that we have slated for an incremental release that's coming up in June. So despite the fact that we trimmed the game past the point where we thought it would be a success, we found that even just putting out what we had gave us enough operating room to give us the chance to put out really just the rest of the game, the content that we have on the back burner.
Nice, very cool. I was also curious if you could talk a little bit more. This is a very designer question, but I was wondering if you could, how much you could talk about the process of like those early prototypes before it was an RPG, and at what point did you all realize as a team, wait, the game that we're making is an RPG? Because that seems like what you were saying happened, that like you prototype a lot of things, you weren't really necessarily going for RPG, but at some point like you found the game. I was wondering if you could talk more about that process and what you're allowed to talk about.
Yeah, I don't think anything in Guildlings is like a secret. It always came down to narrative. We just play tested a ton out of the game, and every time we put it in front of somebody, they got really confused about the way that we handled the story, or even just the core concept that if anyone's played Guildlings, one of the weird little like narrative tricks that we do is like we try to make you feel like you're the main character, and I know every game does that, but I mean like we like really tried to make you feel like you're literally main character, and that your interaction through the phone is the same as the main character's interaction through their phone in the game. So we tried to sort of like break the fourth wall as far as gameplay goes. And that was such a hard concept to sell that we almost gave up on it several times. And it was really by having a lot of very difficult conversations with our team and just sort of constantly being like, hey, is this working? Because like no one gets it. And that process took all of those early prototypes to resolve, to get it to the point where we're just kind of like, like a standard RPG, we put like an introductory cut sequence into this thing, like you've got a party that you move around, like that'll do the trick. And once we put the game in front of somebody and they got through the opening concept of the game without being really confused, we were like, this is the form that our game needs to be.
We're just at about 9 right now, so I think this is a good place. John, did you have any final words before we sign off?
No, just thank you for listening to me like blabber my mouth off for more than an hour, and I'm happy if this was a nice way for you guys to spend some aspect of your quarantine.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, John. Guildlings is on Apple Arcade right now. Everyone should definitely check that out. Thank you, Rob, for posting the link on there. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone who came out and joined us again for this. I think this is our really successful webinar. Our next meeting is May 12th. It's going to probably it'll also be online as well. Please keep an eye out on the Philly IGDA website or the Facebook or the Twitter. We'll have more information about that talk when we have more information for you. But it'll be May 12th. All right, everyone. Thank you all again so much. Thank you Drexel for letting us do the webinar here on Zoom. And yeah, I'll see you all again next month. Everyone, take care.
Thank you.